All right. Well, let's get started. So this is Hammered and Sickle, Volume 2, French Colonialism, Part 1. Kind of a long title there, but there's a lot going on here. We're not going to delve into all of French colonialism because it's long and awful, but we'll focus on a couple parts here, and there may be a part 2 at some other point, but without further ado, we'll get started. So, do this. All right. So, the French colonial empire comprised the overseas colonies, protectorates, and mandate territories that came under French rule from the 16th century onward. A distinction is generally made between the first colonial empire that existed until 1814 and the second colonial empire, which began with the conquest of Algiers in 1830. At its apex between the two world wars, the Second French colonial empire was the second largest colonial empire in the world, behind only the OG British. What's the drink today? What do I got? Well, I got the same whiskey I had last time, but I got a new seasonal brew. In addition, when the whiskey's gone, it's a pistachio nut brown ale. It's tasty. Yeah, let's see. A major goal of the second, the second French colonial empire was what they called the civilizing mission. In 1884, the leading proponent of colonialism, Jules Ferry, said, quote, "The higher races have a right over the lower races. They have a duty to civilize the inferior races." Which, of course, is awful. But there was a lot of that going on. It still is in some cases. But yeah, so that was horrible. So France sent small numbers of settlers, to its empire, with the notable exception of Algeria, where the French settlers took power while being a minority. Let's see. In World War II, Charles de Gaulle and the Free French took control of overseas colonies one by one and used them as bases from which they prepared to liberate France. Historian Tony Chafer argues, in an effort to restore its world power status after the humiliation of defeat and occupation, France was eager to maintain its overseas empire at the end of the Second World War. However, after 1945, anti-colonial movements began to challenge European authority. Major revolts in Indochina and Algeria proved very expensive, and France lost both colonies. All right, so that's an overview of just their colonialism in general. Let's go specifically to the Second French colonial empire, which is where we're going to focus this. At the close of the Napoleonic Wars, most of France's colonies were restored to it by Britain, notably Guadeloupe and Martinique in the West Indies, French Guiana on the coast of South America, various trading posts in Senegal, and France's tiny Indian possessions. In 1825, Charles X sent an expedition to Haiti, resulting in the Haiti Indemnity Controversy. I don't know what that is, and I'm not going to get into it. Haiti might be part 2. But the beginnings of the Second French colonial empire were laid in 1830 with the French invasion of Algeria, which was fully conquered by 1903. So that's a pretty long time it took to fully conquer, quote unquote. But historian Ben Kiernan estimates that 825,000 Algerians died during the conquest by just 1875. So, pretty terrible, of course. Oh, and I should mention, just like the first stream I did, this is all information from Wikipedia, so nothing outstanding again. And I'll have all the links available at some point. Let's see. So let's go to Algeria. The French conquest of Algeria began in 1830 with the invasion of Algiers and was mostly completed by 1852. French colonization of Algeria was undertaken through military conquest and the overthrow of existing structures of government. French colonial rule lasted until Algerian independence in 1962. French colonization of Algeria was defined by its lethality for indigenous Algerians, the dissolution of the Algerian government, and the creation of oppressive and segregationist structures which discriminated against the indigenous population. The French military invasion of Algeria began in 1830 with a naval blockade around Algeria, followed by the landing of 37,000 French soldiers in Algeria. The French captured the strategic port of Algiers in 1830, deposing Hussein Dey, the ruler of the Deylik of Algiers. They also seized other coastal communities, and all told, there were about 100,000 French soldiers deployed in Algeria. Algerian armed resistance against the French invasion was mainly divided between forces of Ahmed Bey ben Mohammed Sharif at Constantine in the east, who was seeking to reinstate the Deylik of Algiers, and nationalist forces in the west and center. Treaties with the nationalists under Emir Abdelkader enabled the French to focus on the defeating of the remnants of the Deylik during the 1837 siege of Constantine. Abdelkader continued to fight the French in the west until 1847. Between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians, out of a total of about 3 million, were killed during the French conquest as a result of war, massacre, disease, and famine. Famines and disease epidemics were partially caused by French confiscation of farmland from Algerians and the, quote, scorched earth, unquote, tactics of raising farms and villages to quell Algerian resistance. French losses from 1830 to 1851 were just over 3,000 killed in action, and it says another 92,000 dead in the hospital. There were about 100,000 European settlers in the country in 1852. At that time, about half of them French. Under the Second Republic, the country was ruled by a civilian government, but Louis Napoleon reestablished a military government, much to the annoyance of the colonists. By 1857, the army had conquered Cable province and pacified the country, but by 1860 the European population had grown to 200,000 and lands of native Algerians were being rapidly bought and farmed by the new arrivals. In the first 8 years of his rule, Napoleon III paid little attention to Algeria. In September 1860, however, he and Empress Eugenie, butchering it I'm sure, but anyway, they visited Algeria, and the trip made a deep impression upon both of them. Eugenie was invited to attend a traditional Arab wedding, and the emperor met many of the local leaders. The emperor gradually conceived the idea that Algeria should be governed differently from other colonies. And in February 1863, he wrote a public letter to Pélissier, the military governor, saying that Algeria is not a colony in the traditional sense, but an Arab kingdom. The local people have, like the colonists, a legal right to my protection. I am the emperor of the Arabs of Algeria, as I am of the French. Towards this end, he invited the chiefs of main Algerian tribal groups to his chateau at Compiègne, for hunting and festivities. Compared to previous administrations, Napoleon III was far from sympathetic to the native Algerians. Far more sympathetic to the native Algerians. He halted European migration inland, restricting them to the coastal zone. He also freed the Algerian rebel leader Abd al-Qadir. He allowed Muslims to serve in the military and civil service on theoretically equal terms and allowed them to migrate to France. In addition, he gave the option of citizenship. However, for Muslims to take this option, they had to accept all of the French civil code, including parts governing inheritance and marriage, which conflicted with Muslim laws. And they had to reject religious Sharia courts. This was interpreted by some Muslims as requiring them to give up parts of their religion, which, of course, they resented. More importantly, Napoleon III changed the system of land tenure. While ostensibly well-intentioned, in effect, this move destroyed the traditional system of land management and deprived many Algerians of land. While Napoleon did renounce state claims to tribal lands, he also began a process of dismantling tribal land ownership in favor of individual land ownership. This process was corrupted by French officials sympathetic to the French in Algeria, who took much of the land they surveyed into public domain. In addition, many tribal leaders, chosen for loyalty to the French, rather than influence in their tribe, immediately sold communal land for cash. His attempted reforms were interrupted in 1864 by an Arab insurrection, which required more than a year and an army of 85,000 soldiers to suppress. I just do a little editorializing here for a minute. The idea that a colonized people can mount an insurrection is false. Obviously, from the French perspective, it was an insurrection, but not to everybody else, I'm sure. All right, continuing. Nonetheless, he did not give up his idea of making Algeria a model where French colonists and Arabs could live and work together as equals. He traveled to Algiers for a second time on May 3rd, 1865, meeting with tribal leaders and local officials. He offered a wide amnesty to participants of the insurrection and promised to name Arabs to high positions in his government. He also promised a large public works program of new ports, railroads, and roads. Excuse me. However, once again, his plans met a major natural obstacle in 1866 and again in 1868. Algeria was struck by an epidemic of cholera, clouds of locusts, drought, and famine, and his reforms were hindered by the French colonists, who voted massively against him in the plebiscites of his late reign. I don't know what the plebiscites is, but maybe we can look it up later. Roughly 500,000 people died from the famine and epidemics. In 1871, in response to prolonged famine and the French authorities' discriminatory treatment of Algerians, the Mokrani revolt in the Kabylia erupted, which spread through much of Algeria. By April 1871, 250 tribes were rebelling. The uprising was defeated in 1872. There were roughly 130,000 colonists in Algeria in 1871, and by 1900 there were 1 million. In 1902, a French military expedition entered Hoger Mountains, not sure how to say that, and defeated the kingdom of Kel Ahager. The conquest of Algeria was fully complete at that point in 1903, with the French in control of all Saharan lands in Algeria. So, yeah, it's pretty awful, of course. Let's see. What time is it? Let's take a brief pause. Okay. All right, excellent. Thank you, Lauren. An astute listener let me know that plebiscites are referendums. It's what we know them as here in the United States. I guess I should be able to figure that out with context clues, but not tonight. So, all right. So that's the end of the part about Algeria in particular. We'll move on. And just as a side note, we are going to be talking about Burkina Faso, which is as it's known as Burkina Faso, it was really no longer had anything to do with the French. But up until that happened, and it changed its name to that, which was in 1982-ish, they were a French colony in various forms. We'll get to them, but I kind of wanted to go through this kind of in order. So let's see. What do we got next? Okay, so France also extended its influence in North Africa after 1870, establishing a protectorate in Tunisia in 1881 with the Bardo Treaty. Gradually, French control crystallized over much of northwest and central Africa by around the start of the 20th century, including modern states of Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea, Mali, Ivory Coast, Benin, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic, Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Cameroon, the East African coastal enclave of Djibouti, and the island of Madagascar. As a part of the Scramble for Africa, France aimed to establish a continuous west-east axis across the continent, in contrast with the proposed British north-south axis. Tensions between Britain and France heightened in Africa. At several points, war seemed possible, but no outbreak occurred. The most serious episode was the Fashada incident of 1898. French troops tried to claim an area in the southern Sudan, and a British force purporting to act in the interest of the Khedive of Egypt arrived to confront them. They weren't acting in the interests of anyone native to Egypt. I know that. It would have been in Britain's interest. Under heavy pressure, the French withdrew, implicitly acknowledging Anglo-Egyptian control of the area. An agreement between the two states recognized the status quo. The British were to maintain control over Egypt, while France remained the dominant power in Morocco. Still, it is commonly believed that France suffered a humiliating defeat overall. This part of this kind of recap here, they talked about the Scramble for Africa, so we'll get into that next. Pause for a minute. I see there's a question in chat. Okay. The Scramble for Africa. This term is used by historians, and it describes the invasion, annexation, division, and colonization of most of Africa by 7 Western European powers during an era known as New Imperialism between 1833 and 1914. All right. By 1841, businessmen from Europe had established small trading posts along the coast of Africa, but they seldom moved inland, preferring to stay near the sea. They primarily traded with locals. Large parts of the continent were essentially uninhabitable for Europeans because of their high mortality rates from tropical diseases such as malaria in the middle of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, European explorers mapped much of East Africa and Central Africa. As late as the 1870s, Europeans controlled approximately 10% of the African continent, with all their territories located near the coasts. The most important holdings were Angola and Mozambique, which were held by Portugal, the Cape Colony held by Great Britain, and Algeria held by France, which, of course, we talked about just a few minutes ago. By 1914, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent of European control, with the former eventually being occupied by Italy in 1936, and the latter having strong connections to the United States. Yay, imperialism. Technological advances facilitated European expansion overseas. Industrialization brought about rapid advancements in in transportation and communication, especially in the form of steamships, railways, and telegraphs. Medical advances also played an important role, especially medicines for tropical diseases, which helped control their effects. The development of quinine, I believe it's called, it was an effective treatment for malaria. It made vast expanses of the tropics more accessible for Europeans. Okay. Now we'll move on to Upper Volta, which is a country, and this is pre-World War II. And that matters because there's also a post-World War II. So let's move on to that. Upper Volta was a colony of French West Africa established in 1919 in the territory occupied by present-day Burkina Faso. It was formed from territories that had been part of the colonies of Upper Senegal and Niger and the Ivory Coast. The colony was dissolved on September 5th, 1932, with parts being administered by the Ivory Coast, French Sudan, and the colony of Niger. After World War II, on September 4th, 1947, After World War II, on September 4th, 1947, the colony was revived as a part of the French Union with its previous boundaries. On December 11th, 1958, it was reconstituted as the self-governing Republic of Upper Volta within the French community. And 2 years later, in August of 1960, it attained full independence. The name Upper Volta indicates that the country contains the upper part of the Volta River, which is divided into three parts, black, white, and red. All right, little bit more history here about French Upper Volta. So until the end of the 19th century, the history of Upper Volta was dominated by the empire-building Mossi kingdoms, maybe Mosi kingdoms, M-O-S-S-I, who are believed to have come up to their present location from present-day northern Ghana. For centuries, the Mossi peasant was both farmer and soldier, and the Mossi people were able to defend their religious beliefs and social structure against forcible attempts to convert them to Islam by Muslims from the northwest. When the French arrived and claimed the area in 1896, Mossi resistance ended with the capture of their capital at Ouagadougou. In 1919, certain provinces from Upper Senegal and Niger were united into a separate colony called the Upper Volta in the French West Africa Federation. In 1932, the new colony was dismembered in a move to economize. It was reconstituted in 1937 as an administrative division called the Upper Coast. After World War II, the Mossi renewed their pressure for separate territorial status, and in September of 1947, Upper Volta became a French West African territory again in its own right. The indigenous population was highly discriminated against. African children were not allowed to ride bicycles or pick fruit from trees. These were privileges reserved for the children of colonists, and violating these regulations could land a parent in jail. So awesome. Tonic water. Interesting. Sorry, just reading the chat there. Okay. Let's see. Where'd I go? Okay. A revision in the organization of French overseas territories began with the passage of Basic Law in July of 1956. This act was followed by reorganizational measures approved by the French Parliament early in 1957 that ensured a large degree of self-government for individual territories. Upper Volta became an autonomous republic in the French community in December of 1958. Upper Volta achieved independence, as we talked about earlier, in August of 1960. The first president, Maurice Yamiogo, was the leader of the Voltaic Democratic Union, the UDV. The 1960 Constitution provided for election by universal suffrage of a president and National Assembly for 5 years. However, soon after coming to power, Yamiogo banned all political parties other than his own. Okay. So that was pre-World War II, a little bit of post-World War II, but mostly pre-World War II. Upper Volta. Let's move on to post World War II. A little deeper dive into the Republic of Upper Volta. All right. The Republic of Upper Volta was a landlocked West African country established in 1958 as a self-governing state within the French community. Before becoming autonomous, it had been a part of the French Union as the French Upper Volta. On August 1960, it gained full independence from France. And in 1984, it changed its name to Burkina Faso, which we'll get into in a little bit. Okay. What was I doing? Read the history. So just a short little bit more history about the Republic of Upper Volta. So as we stated before, they gained their independence in 1960 with Maurice Yamaogo becoming the country's first president. Constitution was ratified that year, establishing presidential elections by direct universal suffrage and a national assembly with 5-year terms. However, he had shown a deep authoritarian streak even before then. Between the time he became prime minister of Upper Volta, while it was still a French colony, and independence 2 years later, opposition parties were subjected to increased harassment. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, Yamaogo banned all other political parties other than his own. In January of 1966, Yamaogo was overthrown in a coup led by Army Chief of Staff Sangul Lamizana. Although multi-party democracy was nominally restored 4 years later, Lamizana dominated the country's politics until he was himself overthrown in 1980. After a series of short-term presidencies, Thomas Sankara then came to power through a military coup of his own in August of 1983. After the coup, he formed the National Council for the Revolution with himself as president, and under the direction of Sankara, the country changed its name August of 1984 from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. When I was looking up doing this little bit of research and reading ahead of time, it dawned on me that we should just call this country the CIA because of all the coups that have happened there. Anyway, moving on. All right. All right, so Burkina Faso, previously called the Republic of Upper Volta, was renamed by President Thomas Sankara. Its citizens are known as Burkinabe, and its capital and largest city is Ouagadougou. Its name is often translated into English as the land of honest men or the land of incorruptible men. Go down to 1983. So we mentioned Thomas Sankara a handful of times. So let's talk about him. In the 1983 coup d'etat. So infighting developed between the right and left factions of the CSP. The leader of the leftists, Captain Thomas Sankara, was appointed prime minister in January 1983, but was subsequently arrested. Excuse me. Efforts to free him, directed by Captain Blaise Compaoré, resulted in a military coup d'etat on August 4th, 1983. I'm butchering these people's names, probably. I'm sorry. But if you listen to the first stream, I was probably pronouncing that one person's name wrong the entire time. Anyway, the coup brought Sankara to power, and his government began to implement a series of revolutionary programs which included mass vaccinations, infrastructure improvements, the expansion of women's rights, encouragement of domestic agricultural consumption, and anti-desertification projects. All right, what's next? So, on August 2nd, 1984, on President Sankara's initiative, the country's name changed from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, or the Land of Honest Men. The presidential decree was confirmed by the National Assembly on August 4th. The demonym for people of Burkina Faso, the Burkinabes, includes expatriates or descendants of people of the Burkinabe origin. Sankara's government comprised the National Council for the Revolution, with Sankara as its president, and established popular committees for the defense of the revolution. The Pioneers of the Revolution youth program was also established. Sankara launched an ambitious socioeconomic program for change, one of the largest ever undertaken on the African continent. His foreign policies centered on anti-imperialism, with his government rejecting pretty much all foreign aid and pushing for odious debt reduction, nationalizing all land and mineral wealth, and averting the power and influence of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. His domestic policies included a nationwide literacy campaign, land redistribution to peasants, railway and road construction, and the outlawing of female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy. Sankara pushed for agrarian self-sufficiency and promoted public health by vaccinating over 2 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and the measles. His national agenda also included planting over 10 million trees to halt the growing desertification of the Sahel. Sankara called on every village to build a medical dispensary and had over 350 communities build schools with their own labor. In the 1980s, when ecological awareness was still very low, Thomas Sankara was one of the few African leaders to consider environmental protection a priority. He engaged in 3 major battles. The first was against bushfires, which he said would be crimes and you could be punished for. Against cattle roaming, which infringes on the rights of peoples because unattended animals destroy nature. And against the anarchic cutting of firewood, whose profession will have to be organized and regulated. As part of a development program involving a large part of the population, 10 million trees were planted in Burkina Faso in 15 months during the revolution. To face the advancing desert and recurrent droughts, Thomas Sankara also proposed the planting of wooded strips of about 50 kilometers crossing the country from east to west. He then thought of extending this vegetation belt to other countries. Cereal production close to 1.1 billion tons before 1983 was predicted to rise to 1.6 billion tons in 1987. Gene Ziegler, former UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Food, said that the country, quote, had become food self-sufficient, unquote. Okay. On October 15th, 1987, Sankara, along with 12 other officials, were assassinated in a coup d'etat organized by Blaise Compaoré. If you'll remember, he's the guy that helped with the original coup to get Sankara into power. Compaoré would go on to serve as Burkina Faso's president from October 87 until October of 2014. After the coup, and although Sankara was known to be dead, some from the CDR mounted an armed resistance to the army for several days. A majority of Burkinabe citizens hold that France's foreign ministry, the Quai d'Orsay, was behind Compaoré in organizing the coup, and there is some evidence for France's support of the coup. All right. So that ends the part about the country itself. I have a hunk here about Thomas Sankara. I'm going to take a 3-minute break, though, 5-minute break at the most. So I'll put it on pause here and be back in a few minutes. All right, we are back. Okay, so like I said, that does it for Burkina Faso and its kind of history through French colonialism. We'll get into Thomas Sankara in particular, because I think he's a rather interesting cat. So here we go. Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara was born in December 1949. He was a Burkinabe military officer, Marxist revolutionary, and Pan-Africanist who served as president of Burkina Faso from his coup in 1983 to his assassination in 1987. He is viewed by supporters as charismatic and an iconic figure of the revolution. After being appointed prime minister in 1983, disputes with the sitting government led to Sankara's eventual imprisonment. While he was under house arrest, a group of revolutionaries seized power on his behalf in a popularly supported coup later that year. He was 33 years old at the time, and became the president of the Republic of Upper Volta and launched social ecological and economic programs and renamed the country from the French colonial name Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, with its people being called the Burkinabe. His foreign policies were centered on anti-imperialism, and he rejected aid from organizations such as the International Monetary Fund. Some of this is a little bit redundant, but we'll get into more specific stuff that we haven't heard yet. Sankara did welcome some foreign aid from other sources, but tried to reduce reliance on aid by boosting domestic revenues and diversifying the sources of assistance. His domestic policies included famine prevention, agrarian self-sufficiency, land reform, and suspending rural poll taxes, as well as a nationwide literacy campaign and vaccinating program, as we've discussed earlier. His government also focused on building schools, health centers, water reservoirs, and infrastructure projects, and he combated desertification of the Sahel by planting over 10 million trees. He outlawed female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy. He set up Cuban-inspired committees for the defense of the revolution. He set up popular revolutionary tribunals to prosecute public officials charged with political crimes and corruption, and considered such elements of the state counter-revolutionaries. This led to some criticism by Amnesty International for human rights violations, including extrajudicial executions and arbitrary detentions of political opponents. Sankara's revolutionary programs for African self-reliance made him an icon to many of Africa's poverty-stricken nations. And Sankara remained popular with a considerable majority of his country's citizens, though some of his policies alienated elements of the former ruling class, including the tribal leaders and the governments of France and its ally, the Ivory Coast. On October 15th, 1987, he was assassinated by troops led by Blaise Compaoré, who assumed leadership of the state shortly thereafter and retained it until 2014. The early life of Thomas Sankara. He was the third of 10 children. His father was a gendarme. And let's see. And his mother was a direct Mossi descendant. He spent his early years in Gaoua, Gaoua. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'd be surprised if I'm pronouncing it correctly at any rate. But anyway, that's a town in the humid southwest to which his father was transferred as an auxiliary gendarme. As the son of one of the few African functionaries then employed by the colonial state, he enjoyed a relatively privileged position. The family lived in a brick house with the families of other gendarmes at the top of a hill overlooking the rest of Gaoua. Sankara attended primary school at a place called Bobo Dioulasso. He applied himself seriously to his schoolwork and excelled in math and French. let's see. His parents wanted him to go to cemetery school when he finished primary school, but instead he decided to keep up with his education. And let's see. What else we got? So his decision to not go to seminary school got him out of his father's household, and was able to go to the school he went to was in the country's commercial center. At that school, he made close friends, including Fidel II, whom he later named a minister in his government, and Soumaïn Touré, who was in a more advanced class. His Roman Catholic parents wanted him to be a priest, but he chose to enter the military instead. The military was popular, having just ousted a despised president. Was also seen by young intellectuals as a national institution that might potentially help to discipline the inefficient and corrupt bureaucracy, counterbalance the inordinate influence of traditional chiefs, and generally help modernize the country. Besides acceptance into the military academy would come with a scholarship. Let me read that again. Besides, acceptance into the military academy would come with a scholarship. Sankara could not easily afford the cost of further education otherwise, so he took the entrance exam and passed. He entered the military academy of Kadiogo in Ouagadougou with the academy's first intake of 1966 at the age of 17. While there, he witnessed the first coup d'etat in Upper Volta, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sangoul Lamazana, who we mentioned earlier. The trainee officers were taught by civilian professors in the social sciences. Adama Touré, who taught history and geography and was known for having progressive ideas, even though he did not necessarily publicly share them, was the academic director at the time. He invited a few of his brightest and more political students, among them Sankara, to join formal discussions about imperialism, neocolonialism, socialism, and communism, and the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, the liberation movements in Africa, and similar topics outside of the classroom. This was the first time Sankara was systematically exposed to a revolutionary perspective on Upper Volta and the world, and aside from his academic and extracurricular political activities, he also played guitar. A random note there, but sounds good. So he was a pretty well-rounded guy, it sounds like. In 1970, 20-year-old Sankara went on for further military studies at the Military Academy of Antsirabe in Madagascar, from which he graduated as a junior officer in 1973. At the academy, the range of instruction went beyond standard military subjects, which allowed him to study agriculture, including how to raise crop yields and better the lives of farmers, themes he later took with him to administration of Burkina Faso. Let's see. After basic military training in secondary school in 1966, he began his military career at the age of 19 and went to Antsirabe in Madagascar. There were also uprisings in 1971 and 72 against the government of Philibert Tsiranana, and first read the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, which profoundly influenced his political views for the rest of his life. That checks out. They had some good ideas. Let's see. He returned to Upper Volta in 1972. He fought in a border war between Upper Volta and Mali. He earned fame for his performance in the conflict. But years later would renounce the fighting as useless and unjust. He also became a popular figure in the capital of Ouagadougou. Sankara was a decent guitarist. He played in a band named Tout-A-Coup Jazz and rode a bicycle. It's hilarious. All right. I'm going to take a side note here. An unplanned thing I need to read about Tout-A-Coup jazz, because I don't know what that is. This is just another Wikipedia thing. We're going to read about it because I like music. All right. Tout-A-Coup Jazz was a musical group formed in the Republic of Upper Volta in the 1970s during the military rule of Colonel General Sangulamazana. In French, tout-à-coup is an adverb meaning suddenly or out of the blue. As the name indicates, the band played jazz and is said to have been relatively popular. The band included Sankara on guitar, his friend Blaise Campari on the microphone. Let's see. There's just a little history about how they met. They met when they were stationed in Morocco. Sankara was taught guitar as a child by someone named Pascal Ouedraogo Kayure. Oh my goodness. I suck so badly at reading these names. Who called him a disciplined student, and that his real passion was music. Let's see. What else does it say? Sankara incorporated his musical experiences into the radical transformation of Voltaic society, which he dubbed the Democratic and Popular Revolution. He often entertained official guests by playing the guitar, and during a massive campaign to vaccinate rural children, he played in the field. At least once during his time as president, he reunited the band with Campore in a surprise appearance, playing in front of an audience. Sankara also wrote an anthem for the renamed Burkina Faso called One Soul Night. He not only focused on his own music, he sponsored domestic musicians and hosted foreign ones, among them Fela Kuti. Don't know who that is, but they were apparently a left-wing Nigerian musician who pioneered Afrobeat, a combination of traditional African music, funk, highlife, and jazz. Affected by Sankara's death, he wrote Underground System as a musical tribute to the only African leader to embrace him and his music. It was a hit, released in 1992. All right, let's get back to Sankara. Sorry for the detour. Just thought that was interesting. I hope you guys did too. Anyway, what was I talking about? Okay. So he played in a band named Tout-A-Coup Jazz and rode a bicycle. In 1976, he became commander of the Commando Training Center in Po. In the same year, he met Blaise Campore in Morocco during the presidency of Colonel Saïd Zerbo. A group of young officers formed a secret organization called the Communist Officers Group, the best known members being Henri Zongo, Jean-Baptiste Bukari Lingani, Blaise Campore, and Sankara. All right. Just going to take a pause a minute, take a couple drinks. How's everybody feeling? See, we still got 3 people that are at least logged in. Thank you for joining me and humoring me. I appreciate it. I hope you guys are having a good time and learning something, whatever you're doing. Presumably you're doing something else while listening to me babble. But hopefully you're getting something from it. I know I am. Therapeutic, and I'm learning stuff, so I'm good about that. Lauren is good but tipsy. So am I. I'm getting there. Lauren, so I said what I was drinking. What are you drinking, Lauren? Lauren says Midnight Moon 100 proof. I don't know what that is. Is that like some kind of like a moonshine knockoff? Sounds wicked strong though, that's for sure. Okay. Let's see. I got enough of a drink there. Yeah. Again, this is Hammered and Sickle. So, a fake shine, says Lauren. So I've got my drinks here, making sure I wet my palate with all kinds of stuff. All right. Okay. back to the show. um, okay, so Sankara was appointed Minister of Information in Sai Zerbo's military government in September of 1981. Sankara differentiated himself from other government officials in many ways, such as biking to work every day instead of driving a car. While his predecessors would censor journalists and newspapers, Sankara encouraged investigative journalism and allowed the media to print whatever it found. This led to publications of government scandals by both privately owned and state-owned newspapers. He resigned that position in 1982 in opposition to what he saw as the regime's anti-labor drift, declaring misfortune to those who gagged the people. After another coup brought to power Major Dr. Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, I'm sorry I'm butchering these people's names, Sankara became prime minister in January 1983, but was dismissed on May 17th. In between those 4 months, he pushed Ouedraogo's regime for more progressive reforms. Sankara was then arrested after the French president's African affairs advisor, Guy Penne, met with Colonel Yorien Some. Henri Zanga and Jean-Baptiste Bukari Lingani, who we mentioned earlier, were also placed under arrest. The decision to arrest Sankara proved to be very unpopular with the young officers in the military regime, and his imprisonment created enough momentum for his friend Blaise Compaoré to lead another coup. Excuse me. Note to self, don't have nachos for dinner before a live stream. Okay. There's a little bit here about his presidency. Okay, so a coup d'etat organized by Blaise Compaoré made Sankara president on August 4th, 1983 at the age of 33. The coup d'etat was supported by Libya, which was at the time on the verge of war with France in Chad. Sankara saw himself as a revolutionary and was inspired by the examples of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, and Ghana's military leader Jerry Rawlings. As president, he promoted the democratic and popular revolution. The ideology of the revolution was defined by Sankara as anti-imperialist in a speech on October 2nd, 1983. His policy was oriented toward fighting corruption and promoting reforestation. On August 4th, 1984, the first anniversary of his ascension, he renamed the country Burkina Faso, meaning the land of upright people. Yet another translation of what we talked about before. In Moure and Ndula, the two major languages of the country. He also gave it a new flag and wrote a new national anthem. When he assumed power on August 4th, he named the leadership of the country the Council of Revolution, or CNR. This was a way for Sankara to signal that he was going to try for political and social change. The CNR composed of both civilians and soldiers, all ordinary people. But the member count was secret due to security reasons and only known to Sankara and others in the inner circle. The CNR regularly met to talk about important plans and decisions for the country. They helped give advice and direction to the government's actions. They voted on suggestions and decisions from government officials. The decision-making was collective, which checks out if you know anything about socialism or, the implementation of socialism known as communism. On some occasions, proposals even favored by Sankara himself were overruled. I suppose that note's put in here just to say, he wasn't, a supreme dictator. So that's good news. All right. Healthcare and public works. So Sankara's first priorities after taking office were feeding, housing, and giving medical care to his people who desperately needed it. He launched a mass vaccination program in an attempt to eradicate polio, meningitis, and the measles. From 1983 to 1985, 2 million residents were vaccinated. Prior to Sankara's presidency, infant mortality in Burkina Faso was about 20%. During his presidency, it fell to 14.5%. His administration was also the first African government to publicly recognize the AIDS epidemic as a major threat to Africa. Large-scale housing and infrastructure projects were also undertaken. Brick factories were created to help build houses in an effort to end urban slums. In an attempt to fight deforestation, the People's Harvest of Forest Nurseries was created to supply 7,000 village nurseries, as well as organizing the planting of several million trees. All regions of the country were soon connected by a vast road and rail building program. Over 700 kilometers or 430 miles of rail was laid to facilitate manganese extraction in the Battle of the Rails without any foreign aid or outside money. These programs were an attempt to prove that African countries could be prosperous without foreign aid or help. Sankara also launched education programs to help combat the country's 90% illiteracy rate. These programs were a great success, and shortly after the assassination of Sankara, wide-scale teacher strikes coupled with the new regime's unwillingness to negotiate led to the creation of revolutionary teachers, quote-unquote. In an attempt to replace the nearly 2,500 teachers fired over the strike in 1996, anyone with a college degree was invited to teach through the Revolutionary Teachers Program. Volunteers merely received a 10-day training course before beginning to teach. Under Sankara's presidency, the literacy rate went from 13% in 1983 to 73% in 1987. Revolutionary Defense Committees. So these were formed as mass armed organizations. The CDRs were created as a counterweight to the power of the army, as well as to promote political and social revolution. The idea for the Revolutionary Defense Committees was taken from Fidel Castro, whose committees for the defense of revolution were created as a form of revolutionary vigilance. A point of contention regarding Sankara's rule is the way he handled the Mossi ethnic group. The Mossi are the largest ethnic group in Burkina Faso, and they adhere to strict traditional hierarchical social systems. At the top of the hierarchy is the Morho Naba, the chief or king of the Mossi people, which Sankara viewed this arrangement as an obstacle to national unity and proceeded to demote the Mossi elite. The Morha Naba was not allowed to hold courts, and local village chiefs were stripped of their executive powers and given to the CDR. Okay. Women's rights. Let's talk about that. So Sankara had extensively worked for women's rights and declared, quote, "There is no true social revolution without the liberation of women," unquote. Improving women's status in Burkinabe society was one of Sankara's explicit goals, and his government included a large number of women, an unprecedented policy priority in West Africa. His government banned female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy, which we've said a couple times earlier, but it's, fine to repeat it, while appointing women to high governmental positions and encouraging them to work outside the home and stay in school even if pregnant. Sankara also promoted contraception and encouraged husbands to go to market and prepare meals to experience for themselves the conditions faced by women. Sankara recognized the challenges faced by African women when he gave his famous address to mark International Women's Day on March 8, 1987 in Ouagadougou. Sankara spoke to thousands of women in a highly political speech in which he stated that the Burkinabe Revolution was, quote, "establishing new social relations," unquote, which would be upsetting the relations of authority between men and women and forcing each to rethink the nature of both. This task is formidable but necessary. So a side note there, he's talking about, I would think, basically dismantling the patriarchy is what that sounds like to me. Furthermore, Sankara was the first African leader to appoint women to major cabinet positions and to recruit them actively to the military. Let's see. What else we got? Let's see. Just taking a minute here to read the chat. Eventually, this might just be an audio version, so I apologize to anybody listening via Spotify or something. There'll be some pauses here where seemingly seems like nothing's happening, and it's because I'm reading chat. Okay. All right. Relations with other countries. So, Thomas Sankara defined his program as anti-imperialist. In this respect, France became the main target of revolutionary rhetoric. These attacks culminated in François Mitterrand's visit to Burkina Faso in November 1986, during which Thomas Sankara violently criticized French policy for having received Pieter Botha, the Prime Minister of South Africa, and Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA, UNITA. I'm not familiar with that organization. He received them both in France. Both, quote, covered in blood from head to toe. French economic aid was reduced by 80% between 1983 and 1985. Guy Pen, or Penet, President Franz Mitterrand's advisor on African affairs, organized a media campaign in France to denigrate Sankara in collaboration with the DGSE, which provided the press with a series of documents on supposed atrocities intended to fuel articles against him. A program of cooperation with Cuba was set up. After meeting with Castro, Thomas Sankara sent young Burkinabes to Cuba in September 1986 to receive professional training and to participate in the country's development upon their return. These were volunteers recruited on the basis of a competition with priority given to orphans and children from rural and disadvantaged areas. Some 600 teenagers were flown to Cuba to complete their schooling and receive professional training to become doctors, engineers, agronomists, or gynecologists. Denouncing the support of the United States to Israel and South Africa, he called on African countries to boycott the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. At the United Nations General Assembly, he also denounced the invasion of Grenada by the United States, which of course responded by implementing trade sanctions against Burkina Faso. So we can see U.S. imperialism, just, trying to ruin everything, right? Especially if it was socialist. It's the CIA, baby. Also at the UN, he called for an end to the veto power granted to the great powers. So, that would be great because that veto power was just used by the United States recently with in regards to Israel and Gaza. If I'm remembering correctly, they vetoed. I forget what it was. I apologize. If someone knows what the U.S. used their veto power for, put it in chat. I just can't remember. It's been a long month for me. Much longer for other people actually suffering, but the ceasefire. Okay, thank you, resist colonizers. I thought that's what it was, but I didn't want to say it and be wrong, so thank you. Okay. Yeah, so in the name of the, quote, right of people's sovereignty, he supported the national demands of the Western Sahara, Palestine, the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, and the South Africa ANC. While he had good relations with Ghanaian leader Jerry Rawlins and Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, he was relatively isolated in West Africa. Leaders close to France, such as, oh my goodness, I'm going to butcher this, I apologize, Houphouët Boigny in the Ivory Coast and Hassan II in Morocco, were particularly hostile to him. If you'll remember from earlier, the Ivory Coast, I think, was still friendly with France at the time, and Morocco, I think, was too. Okay. All right, so now let's move on to the environment. There's a hunk here about that. So in the 1980s, when ecological awareness was still very low, Sankara was one of the few African leaders to consider environmental protection a priority. We already talked about the 3 battles he engaged in against bushfires, cattle roaming, and the cutting of firewood. As part of a development program involving a large part of the population, 10 million trees were planted in Burkina Faso in 15 months during the revolution. To face the advancing desert and recurrent drought, Sankara also proposed the planting of strips of about 50 kilometers, crossing the country from east to west. Jeez, excuse me. Holy shit. He then thought of extending the vegetation belt to other countries, and cereal production rose to 1.6 billion tons by 1987. Beginning in October 1984, over the space of 15 months, Sankara's government planted 10 million trees in a campaign of reforestation. He is quoted as saying, "In Burkina, wood is our only source of energy. We have to constantly remind every individual of his duty to maintain and regenerate nature." Okay. One second. Okay, so now a little bit more about Sankara himself. Get to know him personally. There's some bullet points here we'll read about him. So, as mentioned earlier, he was rather charismatic. Accompanying that, he had an array of original initiatives that contributed to his popularity and brought some international media attention to his government. Cuba rewarded Sankara with the highest honor of the state, the Order of Jose Marti, I believe is how you say that. Some more notes about Sankara. So he sold off the government fleet of Mercedes cars and made the Renault 5, which was the cheapest car sold in Burkina, the official service car of the ministers. He reduced the salaries of well-off public servants, including his own, and forbade the use of government chauffeurs and first-class airline tickets. He opposed foreign aid, saying that he who feeds you controls you. He spoke in forums like the Organization of African Unity against what he described as neo-colonialist penetration of Africa through Western trade and finance, otherwise known as imperialism. I added that there at the end. He called for a united front of African nations to repudiate their foreign debt. He argued that the poor and exploited did not have an obligation to repay money to the rich and exploiting. Hell yeah. The capitalist class. In Ouagadougou, Sankara converted the army's provisioning store into a state-owned supermarket open to everyone, this was apparently the first supermarket in the country. He forced well-off civil servants to pay 1 month's salary to public projects. He refused to use the air conditioning in his office on the grounds that such luxury was not available to anyone but a handful of Burkinabés. As president, he lowered his salary to $450 a month and limited his possessions to a car, 4 bikes, 3 guitars, a refrigerator, and a broken freezer. He's, I guess you would call that walking the walk, as far as someone who's opposed to, the ruling class, the capitalist class, more in favor of the proletariat, right? There isn't much else here about inner workings. It's hard to say if he really felt that way or if it was just on the surface, like he knew he needed to do it. I don't know. I like to think he was on the up and up, but you never know. At any rate, I'm just thinking that out loud. I haven't read anything that makes me think that way. I was just curious. All right. What else we got? Okay, so he required public servants to wear a traditional tunic woven from Burkinabe cotton and sewn by Burkinabe craftsmen. He was known for jogging unaccompanied through the Ouagadougou in his tracksuit and posing in his tailored military fatigues with his mother-of-pearl pistol. That is a link here. I don't know what that is, so I'm going to click on it and read about it. Nacre, N-A-C-R-E, nacre, also known as mother of pearl, is an inorganic composite material produced by mollusks and has an inner shell. Let's see. Okay, so he had a pistol made out of that material. All right, there's not much else there. Okay. When asked why he did not want his portrait hung in public places, as was the norm for other African leaders, Sankara replied, "There are 7 million Thomas Sankaras." We already talked about him writing the new national anthem. Let's see. Sankara gave a speech marking and honoring the 20th anniversary of Che Guevara's 1967 execution 1 week before his own assassination in October 15th of 1987. All right, let's talk about his assassination in particular. So, okay, sorry, had to cough. On October 15th, 1987, Sankara was killed by an armed group with 12 other officials in yet another coup d'etat organized by his former colleague Blaise Compaoré. Side note, this Compaoré guy just does coups, apparently. That's his whole deal. When accounting for his overthrow, Compaoré stated that Sankara jeopardized foreign relations with former colonial power France and neighboring Ivory Coast, and accused his former comrade of plotting to assassinate opponents. Prince Johnson, a former Liberian warlord allied to Charles Taylor, and killer of the Liberian president Samuel Doe, whose last hours of life were filmed, told Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission that it was engineered by Charles Taylor. I'm not familiar with that. After the coup, and although Sankara was known to be dead, some CDRs mounted an armed resistance. According to Haluna Traore, the sole survivor of Sankara's assassination, Sankara was attending a meeting with the Conseil Dilettante. His assassins singled out Sankara and executed him. The assassins then shot at those attending the meeting, killing 12 other people. His body was riddled with bullets to the back, and he was quickly buried in an unmarked grave, while his widow and 2 children fled the nation. Compaoré immediately reversed the nationalizations, overturned nearly all of Sankara's policies, rejoined the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to bring in desperately needed funds to restore the shattered economy, and ultimately spurned most of Sankara's legacy. Compaoré's dictatorship remained in power for 27 years until it was overthrown by protests in 2014. Like I said, they should change the name again of this country to the CIA. There's just coup after coup after coup. I didn't mention it earlier in something, but I did when I was looking this stuff up earlier. I saw like a list of coups, stuff I didn't even mention, but there were coups, at least 6 coups, if not more, in this country's history. So, we got a lot of that going on. Okay. The assassination trial. So, it wasn't until 2017 that the Burkina Faso government officially asked the French government to release military documents on the killing of Sankara, after his widow accused France of masterminding his assassination. In April 2021, 34 years after Sankara's assassination, former President Compaoré and 13 others were indicted for complicity in the murder of Sankara, as well as other crimes in the coup. This development came as part of President Roch Kabor's framework of national reconciliation. In October 2021, the trial against Compaoré and 13 others began in Ouagadougou, with Compaoré being tried in absentia. Ex-presidential security chief Hyacinth Kafando was also tried in absentia. A week before the trial, Compaoré's lawyers stated that he wouldn't be attending the trial, which they characterized as having defects, and also emphasized his privilege for immunity, being the former head of state. It sounds kind of familiar. After requests made by the defense attorneys for more time to prepare their defense, the hearing was postponed until March 1st. On April 6, 2022, Campari and 2 others were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison in absentia. 8 others were sentenced to between 3 and 20 years in prison. And 3 were found innocent. I'm not familiar with in absentia, so I'm going to look that up quick. A trial in absentia is a criminal proceeding in a court of law in which the person is subject to is not physically present. Yeah, okay, I guess that makes sense, but... Okay, so... I guess that's what I thought it was, but... Just... Anyway. So what they're saying here is Campari was sentenced to life in prison without even being absent for the trial. So, alright. Okay. 20 years after his assassination, Sankara was commemorated on October 15, 2007 in ceremonies that took place in Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, Niger, Tanzania, Burundi, France, Canada, and the United States. A statue of Sankara was unveiled in 2019 at the location in Ouagadougou where he was assassinated. In 2023, the government of Burkina Faso formally proclaimed Sankara as a hero of the nation. And just last month, October of 23, on the 36th anniversary of his assassination, the government changed a main road name in Ouagadougou to honor Sankara. The road in question was the Boulevard Charles de Gaulle, now known as Boulevard Capitaine Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara. All right. What are we at? 9:30. Man. Took a lot longer than I thought. First couple of readings were going. At any rate, that's the end of the prepared stuff. And everybody have a good night. Thanks.